A priceless treasure, a locked box, and a puzzle no one can solve. Now let's begin. The November fog lay thick over London, covering the gas lamps so that their light seemed no more than pale, floating balls in the damp air. It was on such an evening that I found myself sitting in front of our fireplace at Baker Street, listening to the restless walking of Sherlock Holmes. He had been quiet for most of the afternoon, except for an occasional quick question about where a certain train schedule was, or the angle of light coming through the northern window at Euston Station. I knew these disconnected questions for what they were, the gathering pieces of a case forming in that amazing mind. At last he stopped, one long finger pressed against his lips, the other hand holding a thin, cream-coloured envelope. "Watson," said he, "how familiar are you with Eversham Abbey?" I confessed to knowing nothing beyond its name, and the vague feeling of some ancient religious building fallen into ruin. "Your lack of knowledge is to your advantage," he remarked. "You shall approach the matter with a clear mind. This," he tapped the letter, "is from the Reverend Dr. Alistair Grarival, current keeper of that building, and it contains the seeds of a puzzle worthy of our attention." Holmes passed me the letter, its neat church handwriting, telling about the recent theft of a treasure known as the Bloodstone of Eversham, a ruby of deep red colour long kept in the Abbey's treasure box. No sign of forced entry had been found. Indeed, the treasure box itself appeared untouched, yet the gem was gone. Stranger still, the theft was joined by a scrap of old paper bearing a mysterious riddle in old-fashioned verse. Scotland Yard had been told, but the local inspector admitted himself completely confused, and Dr. Grarival, remembering Holmes's reputation, had asked directly for help. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the flickering firelight. Their vanished treasure without the appearance of breaking in, a teasing riddle, and a setting filled with centuries of history. "Surely you see the attractions, Watson." Without waiting for my reply, he grabbed his travelling cloak from the hook. "We take the morning train to Worcestershire. Bring your gun. Abbeys are seldom as peaceful as their stones suggest." Thus it was that by the following noon we got off at a windswept country station, the cold air carrying the distant ring of a single sad bell. As we approached the carriage sent to meet us, I caught my first glimpse of the Abbey rising upon its hill, a fortress of grey stone against a dark sky. The driver, a bent fellow with worried eyes, touched his cap and muttered, "Best be careful up there, gentlemen. The Bloodstone's curse has taken more than a few in its time." Holmes only smiled thinly, settling himself for the ride. "Superstition, Watson," he murmured. "Yet superstition is but ignorance in fancy dress, and ignorance, I think, is about to play us a very complicated game." The road from the little station to the Abbey wound like a ribbon through bare-limbed trees, their branches black against the pale winter sky. The driver, whose name we learned was Hargreaves, spoke little, except for an occasional grunt when the wheels hit a hole. Holmes sat still, his long fingers pointed before his chin, looking out at the fields shining with frost. I could tell by the distant focus of his eyes that he was already putting together the structure of the problem in his mind, placing each fact into its proper spot. "You observed," he said at last, without turning toward me, "that Hargreaves gave his warning in the form of a statement, not a belief. He did not say he feared the curse, Watson. He said the curse had taken lives. That difference may prove useful later." We bumped over a narrow stone bridge, and the great shape of Eversham Abbey rose fully into view. Its huge main building and western towers stood serious against the hills, their outlines softened by centuries of weather. The place had a strange heaviness to it, as if it carried the weight of not only its own history, but of countless untold stories locked within its covered walkways. A low wall surrounded the grounds, and beyond the gatehouse the courtyard opened upon a covered walkway, its row of pointed arches framing the winter light. Dr. Grarival awaited us in the covered walkway, a tall thin man in a black robe, his face pale and lined. He greeted us with a certain controlled relief, leading us quickly inside. The Abbey's interior was cold, the air faintly scented with incense and old stone. Sunlight filtered through the high windows in quiet beams, touching the worn floor stones with a ghost of warmth. "I must apologize for calling you under such circumstances," he said, leading us down the north aisle toward the cross-section. "The Bloodstone is of no small importance here, not only for its historical and religious value, but for what it represents to the church members. Its disappearance has already given rise to the most unfortunate whispers. Whispers, Holmes asked. The idea of a curse, Mr. Holmes, Grerival replied, his mouth tightening. It is an old superstition hard to remove. The Bloodstone is said to have been stained with the blood of the martyr Edric, who was killed by Norman soldiers upon this very spot in the year 1087. The stone was set into a treasure box and kept as a holy treasure. Over the centuries, those who have tried to possess it by dishonest means have often met bad ends. At least so the stories go. Holmes gave a faint, impatient wave of the hand. A charming piece of legend, but such things do not steal themselves. Show me the scene of the crime, if you please. We passed into the south cross-section, where a small chapel stood apart from the main altar. At its center rose a marble stand upon which rested a golden treasure box in the form of a small shrine. It was a beautiful object, its enamel panels showing scenes from the life of the saint, its roof decorated with tiny towers and ornaments, but it was the hollow space at its heart that drew the eye. The treasure box is never left unguarded, Grerival explained. It is secured by a lock of considerable age and difficulty. The churchkeeper, Mr. Morton, and I are the only ones with keys. We last saw the Bloodstone in place after evening prayers 3 nights ago. The next morning it was gone. Yet the lock was untouched, and there is no sign of tampering. Holmes bent low over the treasure box, pulling from his pocket a small magnifying glass. He examined the lock, the golden surface, and the stand itself with patient care, pausing at times to trace some detail with the tip of his finger. I could tell he was noting features invisible to my untrained eye. "And this riddle you mentioned in your letter?" he asked. Grerival reached into his robe and drew forth a folded scrap of old paper, which he handed to Holmes. The writing was in a spider-like hand, the ink brown with age. Within the abbey's shadow, deep where stone and silent secrets keep, the red heart shall rest once more beyond the reach of lock and door. Holmes read the lines twice, his forehead wrinkled. "Found where?" "On the altar step, just below the treasure box. No one has claimed responsibility. The handwriting is unlike anything in our records. It may be a recent fake, but I cannot say." Holmes turned the old paper in his hands, smelled it, and held it briefly to the light from the chapel window. "Modern paper would show a different texture," he murmured. "Yet this is not of the 11th century either. Curious, and the ink, yes, quite fresh." He moved to the chapel floor, crouching to study the floor stones. "Tell me, Dr. Grerival, was this area cleaned after the discovery?" "Yes, the church worker was told to sweep away any mess, lest the place become a show for the curious. I fear that may have destroyed any traces." Holmes sighed almost silently. "The best intentions, Watson, are often the most destructive to evidence." He rose, dusting his knees. Still, not all traces are so easily erased. At that moment, a figure appeared in the doorway, a short, heavy man with a red face and an expression of suspicion that seemed to settle naturally upon strangers. Dr. Grerival introduced him as Mr. Morton, the churchkeeper. Morton's story differed little from the rector's, except for his repeated insistence that the theft could only have been the work of an outsider. "No one from the abbey would dare," he said, almost with anger. "The place is locked at night, and I keep the keys upon my person. I tell you, some villain crept in under cover of darkness." Holmes looked at him thoughtfully. "And you found no sign of forced entry? No open doors, no damaged locks?" "None," Morton said flatly. Holmes made no comment, but I saw his eyes flick toward the man's left sleeve, where a faint smear of dust or plaster clung unnoticed. We took our leave of the chapel and followed Dr. Grerival through a passage into the covered walkway. Outside, the winter sun had dropped lower, casting the arches into deep shadow. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, and the echo of our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. Holmes paused by a narrow archway leading into a side garden, his eyes sweeping the ground. A faint dent in the moss caught his attention. He crouched, measured it with his thumb, and rose without a word. We returned to the guest house where rooms had been prepared for us. As we warmed ourselves before the fire, Holmes spoke at last. "Watson, the Abbey is a self-contained world. Its population is small, its routines regular, its locks numerous and old-fashioned. For the Bloodstone to vanish without disturbance suggests 2 possibilities. Either an agent with close knowledge of its security, or one able to bypass that security altogether. The latter is rare, the former all too common. You suspect one of the Abbey's own." "I suspect anyone who had opportunity," he said, "which in this case narrows the field to a manageable few." The problem is not in finding those with access, but in deciding which among them has the will and the cleverness to write so strange a riddle. A knock at the door interrupted us. Hargreaves, the driver, stepped in, cap in hand. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Holmes, "but I thought you might want to know. There's been talk in the village. A stranger's been seen near the Abbey after dark these past 2 nights. Tall fellow wrapped in a great coat, face hidden under the brim of his hat. No one knows him." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Thank you, Hargreaves. That is most helpful." When the man had gone, Holmes turned to me with the faintest smile. "We must be careful not to mistake the visible for the important, Watson. A stranger seen is one who wishes or is willing to be seen. The truly dangerous man is he who passes unseen entirely." Outside, the Abbey bell rang the hour, its sound rolling across the frozen fields. Somewhere within those ancient walls a red stone lay hidden, its absence already stirring fear and suspicion, and I, for my part, could not shake the sense that the next turn of events might bring danger closer than either of us expected. The following morning broke cold and bright, a pale sun filtering through the frost-covered window panes of our bedroom. From beyond the Abbey walls, I could hear the slow ringing of morning prayer mixing with the distant cry of crows in the bare treetops. Holmes was already awake, seated at the small writing table with the riddle paper before him, his long hands folded under his chin. "Observe, Watson," he said without warning, "that our mysterious poet speaks of the Abbey's shadow, not the Abbey itself, holding the Bloodstone. One might guess that the hiding place lies outside the immediate interior, perhaps in some structure or corner, touched by the Abbey's shadow during certain hours of the day. That would hardly narrow the search," I remarked. "The shadow could fall upon any number of places given the sun's changing position." "Quite so. But the mention of stone and silence suggests a location both private and built of stone. I think perhaps of some unused portion of the complex, a crypt, a chapter house, even an old boundary wall." He tucked the old paper into his pocket and rose. "Let us explore, Watson. But first, we must hear from those who can tell us what the rector has not." By this he meant the lay brothers and servants, the quiet eyes and ears of any establishment, church or otherwise. We began in the kitchens, where the morning's bread was being drawn steaming from the oven. The cook, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Porter, greeted us tiredly until Holmes, with his usual skill, got her talking about the proper heat for stone ovens. In the course of this seemingly idle chatter, he drew from her an admission that Mr. Morton, the church keeper, had been seen late at night in the South Cross section, well after evening prayers 2 evenings before the theft. "Fetching candles," he said, Mrs. Porter told us, wiping flour from her hands. "But I can't see why he'd need so many, nor why he'd carry them in a bag rather than a tray." From the kitchens we passed into the covered walkway, a square of frost-covered grass enclosed by the arched walkway. Here we met Brother Anselm, a thin, stooping man whose duties included tending the Abbey's small library. His manner was hesitant, but he confirmed that an unfamiliar man matching Hargreaves's description had indeed been seen in the outer court. "He came to the gatehouse asking to see Dr. Grerival," Anselm whispered, looking around. "When told the rector was busy, he left without giving his name. I thought no more of it, except that he walked with a slight limp." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A limp, you say? Left leg or right?" "The right, sir." It was plain enough. We thanked the brother and continued our tour of the Abbey. Holmes moved with that strange, almost hunting attentiveness I had seen in him so often, his eyes darting to the smallest oddities, the uneven wear on a step, a cobweb swaying where none had been the day before, the faint scrape along the lower edge of a door. It was in the west range near the unused chapter house that he paused longest. The heavy oak door was secured by an iron clasp and padlock, yet in the frost upon the doorway I saw the faint mark of a boot heel larger than mine, and fresh enough to have been made within the last day. "Someone has taken the trouble to come here very recently," Holmes murmured, "and unless the good rector holds secret meetings in the dust, I should think it worth our while to see inside." The key was gotten from a reluctant Dr. Grerival, who admitted the room had not been used in years. Within, the air was close and heavy with the smell of old plaster. Beams of light from high, narrow windows revealed benches lining the walls, a central desk thick with dust, and piles of worn account books. Holmes prowled the edges, his gaze sweeping upward to the ceiling, downward to the floor, never staying in one place for more than a few seconds. It was at the far end that he found what he sought, a section of floor stone slightly lighter than the rest, its edges showing the faintest disturbance of cement. Pulling out his penknife, he worked at the crack until the stone shifted slightly under his hand. Beneath was a hole barely large enough to admit a man's arm. He reached in, pulled out nothing, and replaced the stone with careful precision. "Empty," I observed. "For the moment," he replied. "But that hole was prepared with skill. It has been opened recently, though not last night. I dare say it has served as a hiding place, whether for the Bloodstone or something else. We shall see." We secured the chapter house once more and came out into the brittle light of noon. As we crossed the covered walkway, we were stopped by Inspector Lestrade, who, to my surprise, had arrived from London by the morning train. His face had that mixture of suspicion and defensiveness with which he usually greeted Holmes. "I thought you might try to keep this little business to yourself," Lestrade said, pulling his coat tighter. "But Dr. Grerival wired Scotland Yard again, and here I am. Perhaps you've made some of your famous guesses already." Holmes's smile was thin. "A few observations, yes. For example, the riddle is meant not merely to tease, but to mislead. It sends the eye toward places of obvious privacy, while the true hiding place may be in plain sight. And then there is the matter of our limping stranger, whose presence at the gatehouse so near the time of the theft is hardly coincidence." Lestrade snorted. "Or he could be a harmless traveller. I've got my men checking the inns. Meanwhile, I'd like to examine this treasure box for myself." Holmes waved a hand in agreement. "By all means, you may even notice something of interest, if you are very lucky." The rest of the day was used in quiet but careful investigation. Holmes spoke with the church worker, studied the Abbey's layout from the tower, and even measured the angle of the afternoon sun upon the south cross-section wall. At one point he sent me to note the position of shadows cast upon the outer court while he remained in the covered walkway, timing my movements to the chime of the bell. It was during these walks that we met Morton once more. The church-keeper's manner was less friendly than before, and he seemed eager to be done with our questions. Yet Holmes continued, drawing from him the fact that the key to the treasure box had been briefly out of his sight on the evening before the theft, left on a table while he answered a knock at the church-room door. "And who was at the door?" Holmes asked. "No one," Morton replied after a pause. "Or at least no one I could see. When I stepped outside, there was no one in the passage." That answer clearly pleased Holmes, for he looked at Morton with an expression of polite interest and stopped pressing further. By dusk, the Abbey lay under a wash of orange light, the shadows long and cold across the courtyard. We dined with Dr. Grerival in the guest-house dining room, Lestrade joining us with a report that no inns had admitted housing a tall, limping stranger. Holmes listened without comment, his eyes half closed as though thinking about some internal math. Later in our bedroom, he pulled out the riddle once more and laid it beside a quickly drawn sketch of the Abbey's plan. "Watson, note here. The line of the shadow at evening prayers midwinter falls directly along the wall of the old writing room. That wall, as you recall, is partly collapsed and overgrown. It is not locked, nor does it have any door to block entry. Yet it is within the Abbey's shadow in every sense. You believe the Bloodstone may be hidden there. I believe," he said slowly, "that the writing room offers the perfect balance between ease of access and hiding. And if the stone is not there now, it may well pass through it on its way elsewhere." We agreed to inspect the place at first light, though Holmes added almost to himself that our presence should be arranged so as to appear accidental. As I covered the fire for the night, I could not rid myself of the uneasy feeling that someone within those silent hallways was even then watching us, measuring our movements, weighing their next step in a game we had only begun to understand. From the darkened covered walkway came the muffled sound of footsteps, too slow and careful for any of the brothers at their prayers. Holmes, who had been sitting still, raised a hand for silence. The footsteps passed beneath our window, paused, and then moved away into the shadowed court. "You heard it, Watson?" he asked softly. "Yes, who was it?" "That," Holmes replied, "is what we shall discover before the Bloodstone changes hands again, if indeed it has not already." The night at Eversham Abbey was never fully silent. Even in the deepest hours, the wind hummed faintly through the high-covered walkway arches, and somewhere within the walls a draught would stir the old oak beams, so they creaked like uneasy sleepers. Yet after those careful footsteps faded into the courtyard, the stillness seemed to tighten about us, every sound more clear for being surrounded by such heavy quiet. Holmes did not move from his chair by the window for some minutes, his profile lit in pale light by the moonlight slanting through the leaded glass. When at last he rose, it was with that smooth, controlled speed I had come to connect with his most serious work. "Watson," he said, "we shall take a brief walk. The hour is late enough that any movement outside must have purpose, and I'm curious to see what purpose brings someone to cross the covered walkway at such a time." I wrapped my great coat about me, and together we went down the narrow stair to the covered walkway. The air was sharp with frost, and our breath rose in pale clouds. Moonlight spilled across the grass, silvering the lawn and glinting off the stone decorations. We moved in silence, our footsteps absorbed by the ancient paving stones. Holmes stopped suddenly near the south walkway, kneeling to examine something upon the floor stones. It was a faint smudge, too large and shapeless to be a footprint, yet dark enough to catch his attention. He drew from his pocket a small paper envelope, scraped a trace of the substance into it with his penknife, and tucked it away. We reached the archway that led to the outer court. There the thin layer of frost upon the ground showed the clearer print of a boot sole. Holmes bent over it, running his fingers lightly along the edge. "The same footprint as by the chapter house door yesterday," he murmured. "And notice the right heel is worn more heavily than the left. Our limping stranger again, Watson." Following the trail as far as the pale light allowed, we came to the side gate in the wall around the grounds. The heavy wooden door was bolted on the inside, yet the bootprint stopped directly before it, turned sharply and went back into the court. Holmes straightened, eyes narrowed. A stop task or a look around. Either way, it was not meant to go unnoticed, else our friend would have avoided leaving so clear a mark in the frost. We returned to our rooms without meeting another soul. Holmes spent the remaining hours until dawn in quiet thought, stretched upon the bed with his hands behind his head, the riddle paper open beside him. I slept fitfully, and when I awoke, the sun was lifting its pale circle above the eastern hills. After a quick breakfast, we made our way to the writing room. The building lay at the abbey's western edge, partly roofless, its crumbling stone walls covered with moss. We stepped inside through a broken arch, our boots crunching on a scatter of fallen cement. The air smelled faintly of damp old paper, as though the ghost of old books still lingered here. Holmes examined the walls with a careful gaze, tracing the shadow lines cast by the low sun. At one corner, where the wall met a collapsed small room, the ground was uneven, a bump of earth crusted with frost. Kneeling, he brushed the surface with his gloved hands, revealing the rotted edge of a wooden board beneath. With some effort, we lifted the board to uncover a narrow pit. It was empty, except for a scrap of torn cloth caught upon a splinter. Holmes studied it closely before tucking it into his pocket. "Recently disturbed," he said. "See the frost upon the surrounding ground. It is solid everywhere except here. Whatever was hidden has been removed within the past 12 hours. We were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Lestrade, his boots loud upon the broken stone. "You might have told me you were coming here," he said irritably. "I've been looking for you since breakfast. There's been another development." He led us back through the covered walkway to Dr. Greville's study, where the rector sat pale and clearly shaken. Upon his desk lay a folded sheet of paper, unsealed. Holmes opened it with delicate fingers. The writing was the same spider-like hand as the previous riddle, but this time the words were even more pointed. "The red heart beats yet unseen, where past and present meet between. Seek not in shadow, stone, or prayer. You'll find it only if you dare." Holmes read the lines aloud, his voice even, though I thought I detected a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "It seems," he said, "that our opponent wishes to guide us away from the Abbey's structure altogether, or to make us believe so." Dr. Greville clasped his hands. "I cannot bear these teasing messages, Mr. Holmes. The brothers grow restless, and the villagers speak of the curse as though it were fact." Holmes laid the note gently upon the desk. "Which is exactly what the writer wants, to confuse our search. The second riddle shifts the focus, but in doing so it also reveals that the first was not meant to be taken at face value. One does not warn against a line of questioning unless it approaches the truth." Lestrade frowned. "You're saying the Bloodstone is still in the Abbey?" "I'm saying," Holmes replied, "that it has not left the Abbey's control. Whether it lies within these walls, or in some place linked closely to them, I cannot yet say." Holmes requested a full list of all persons who had access to the Abbey after hours, Monks, servants, visiting clergy and lay workers. Dr. Graville provided the names reluctantly, and Holmes studied them with narrowed eyes. Morton, Brother Anselm, Mrs. Porter and Hargreaves, though he seems an unlikely keeper of medieval rubies. Still, I make it a rule never to exclude the unlikely until it is proven wrong. That afternoon, Holmes set me to a seemingly idle task, walking the village lanes to note any strangers staying, any recent hire of a cart or horse, and any gossip about the abbey. I returned with little beyond confirmation that a limping man had been seen hanging around near the blacksmith the previous day. The blacksmith himself claimed the fellow had asked about the road to Eversham Hall, a house some miles distant, before leaving on foot. Holmes listened, then drummed his fingers upon the arm of his chair. Eversham Hall, owned by the Fairchild family. If memory serves, old money but recent money troubles. Curious, we shall pay them a visit tomorrow. That evening, as the abbey bell rang evening prayers, Holmes suggested we take a final turn through the covered walkway. The air was brittle with cold, and frost already silvered the stone. As we passed the south cross-section, Holmes stopped suddenly, his gaze fixed upon the treasure box within. A single candle burned on the altar, casting a wavering glow over the golden towers. Without a word, Holmes stepped inside and moved to the altar rail. His hand shot out, picking something from the step. "A tiny piece of red wax, sealing wax, Watson," he murmured. "And not from any candle here. Our thief has been close to the treasure box since the theft. Perhaps to reassure himself of his victory, perhaps for another purpose entirely." We had barely left the chapel when a shadow pulled away from the covered walkway arch ahead. It was Morton. His expression was guarded, and his hands were buried deep in the folds of his robe. "Still prowling, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Only as much as the truth demands." Holmes returned evenly. "And you, Mr. Morton, do the duties of the church keeper extend to solitary walks in the covered walkway at night?" Morton's eyes flickered, and he muttered something about securing the church room before brushing past us. Holmes watched him go, the faintest of smiles curving his lips. "Watson," he said quietly, "our target is growing restless. That is the most dangerous time for a criminal, and the most useful for us. I think we are not far now from the point at which all these scattered threads will begin to knot." As we returned to our rooms, the moon rode high over the abbey towers, and I could not shake the feeling that the ancient stones themselves were leaning in to listen, holding their breath for the moment when the Bloodstone's secret would be laid bare. Dawn crept over Eversham Abbey with a weak light that bled slowly into the covered walkways, touching the frost on the floor stones until they glimmered like pale silver. Holmes was already dressed when I awoke, his lean form outlined against the window. He held the 2 riddle slips in one hand, the torn scrap of cloth from the writing room in the other, turning them over with the same absent, careful care one might give to chess pieces before the winning move. "Watson," he said without turning, "have you noticed the second riddle's most curious quality?" I admitted I had not beyond its purposeful shift in focus. It is a riddle that points away rather than toward, and yet it uses a space clue where past and present meet between. That phrasing is not poetic fancy. It is building-related. There is in every old building a place where original structure meets later addition. Walls are joined at different angles. Stones differ in cut. Such joints are often imperfect, creating spaces invisible to the casual eye. He tucked the items into his coat and took up his hat. "Today, my dear fellow, we visit Eversham Hall, but before we set out I mean to look at one particular joint in the abbey walls." We crossed the covered walkway to the north aisle of the main building, where a line of stonework changed suddenly in colour and cutting. Holmes ran his fingers along the join, pausing at a section where the cement was newer, fixed recently. Yet the surrounding stone is untouched. That alone is worth remembering, Watson. By mid-morning, Hargreaves had prepared the small carriage and we set out toward Eversham Hall. The lane was lined by bare hedge, the fields lying bare under the pale sky. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, eyes fixed on some internal map of connections. When the hall came into view, a sprawling Elizabeth-era house of weathered brick, he stirred himself and observed. "Note the chimneys, Watson. Half the flues are cold, the rest smoking weakly, a household reduced, keeping only a portion of its rooms in use." We were received by Lady Eleanor Fairchild, a tall, dignified woman whose eyes showed a mixture of pride and strain. Her father, she explained, was confined upstairs with gout. and her brother was away on business. We gave a general excuse of asking about local history, and Holmes steered the conversation toward the Abbey's treasures. "The Bloodstone," Lady Eleanor repeated, a flicker of unease crossing her features. "Yes, I have heard it has gone missing. A dreadful business, but what could we possibly have to do with it?" Holmes's tone was mild. Perhaps nothing, and yet a stranger, tall, limping, was seen in the village asking the way here only yesterday. Her composure faltered a moment, then she recovered. "That may have been our manager's nephew. He came to discuss some land matter. He does limp from an old riding injury." Holmes nodded his head politely but did not push the point. Instead, he asked whether the hall had ever owned church objects from the Abbey. Lady Eleanor admitted that in the confusion following the dissolution, certain items had been given into her family's care. Cups, robes, even carved panels. But most had been returned in the last century. We took our leave shortly thereafter. As soon as we were out of sight of the hall, Holmes told Hargreaves to stop the carriage and wait. We then struck across a frozen meadow toward a stand of yew trees. There, half hidden among the trees, stood a small square building of stone, its door secured by a rusted padlock. Holmes examined the lock and chuckled. "Seized solid. It has not been opened in years, yet the ground before it shows recent disturbance. Someone has walked here more than once in the past week." He pointed to the grass bent and frostburnt in irregular patches. "And there, Watson, a small piece of red wax, the twin of what I found at the treasure box." We returned to the carriage in silence. Holmes's mind was plainly working at full speed, and I knew better than to interrupt. It was only as we neared the Abbey again that he spoke. The padlock was untouched by force, so whoever entered that building, if indeed it was entered, did so with a key. Keys to outbuildings of the hall are hardly common in the village. The circle tightens, Watson. Upon our arrival, we found Lestrade in the covered walkway, looking more flustered than usual. "Holmes, there's been a disturbance. The church keeper claims someone tried to force the church room door last night. The lock was scratched, but nothing taken." Holmes looked at him keenly. "Scratches fresh?" "Bright as the day," Lestrade confirmed. "Then the attempt was staged," Holmes said flatly. "A trick meant to suggest our culprit is desperate to get in, when in fact he already has all he needs. That is twice now we have been shown the wrong hand, while the real one works unseen." We went to the church room where Holmes examined the lock. He pulled out his glass, traced the scratches and nodded. "Made with a blunt tool, purposely crude work. Our thief is capable of delicacy. This is theatre." The rest of the afternoon Holmes spent in solitary exploration of the Abbey's upper passages. When he rejoined me in the guest house as dusk fell, his eyes were bright with hidden excitement. "Watson, the joint I examined this morning, where the newer stone meets the old, hides a narrow space reachable from a loft above the north aisle. It is unlit, unused, and would serve admirably as a temporary hiding place. I found a fine layer of dust disturbed in a patch exactly the size of the treasure box's hole." "You mean the Bloodstone was hidden there?" "For a time, yes, but it has been moved, I think, to a place still within the Abbey's reach, possibly in preparation for its removal altogether." The second riddle was a warning to us. If we did not discover that joint soon, we would lose the trail. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock. It was Brother Anselm, looking pale. "Forgive me, but I thought you should know. Mr. Morton has just left the Abbey in the company of a tall man in a great coat." They took the lane toward the hall. Holmes's expression hardened. "Watson, it seems the hour for quiet watching is past. If the Bloodstone is to change hands tonight, we must be present at the exchange." Within minutes we were on the move, Hargreaves urging the carriage down the lane under the deepening blue of early night. Frost crackled under the wheels, and the bare branches overhead scratched at the moon. As we neared the yew trees, Holmes signaled for silence. We got out and went on foot, our breath clouding in the cold. The small stone building loomed ahead, its doorway slightly open. From within came the gleam of a lantern. We crept forward until we could see Morton standing beside the limping stranger who was bending over an open chest. The Bloodstone lay within, its deep red catching the lamplight like a coal. Holmes's hand closed on my arm. "Not yet," he breathed. "Let us hear the bargain." The stranger's voice was low, but I caught pieces. "Payment tomorrow. No one will suspect." Morton replied in a worried whisper I could not make out. Then the man reached for the gem. Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting the night like a blade. "That will do, gentlemen. Morton spun around with a cry, the lantern swinging wildly. The stranger straightened, his right leg stiff, and I saw his hand go toward his coat pocket. But Lestrade, who had followed us unseen, stepped in from the other side, gun drawn. "You're both under arrest," he said briskly. The confrontation was brief. The stranger, later identified as one Henry Cade, a shady dealer in antiques, was disarmed, and Morton, pale and trembling, offered no resistance. The Bloodstone was placed in Holmes's keeping, its surface cold and impossibly smooth under the moonlight. As we returned to the Abbey, Holmes's manner was oddly quiet. "The game is not over, Watson," he said quietly. "We have recovered the gem, yes, but the manner of its hiding and the curious riddles suggest a mind more clever than Morton or Cade's. These two are but the visible end of a longer chain. Until I find the hand that set this in motion, the Bloodstone's mystery remains unsolved." And in the silence that followed, I knew he was right. The true opponent had yet to step into the light. The following day broke with a sky the color of old pewter, the frost having thickened in the night, until every branch and tower wall glittered with a brittle edge. The recovery of the Bloodstone had, as might be expected, caused no small stir within the Abbey. Dr. Grarevel expressed a relief so deep that it bordered on exhaustion, while Lestrade, in the comfortable glow of an immediate arrest, had already begun writing a report to Scotland Yard. Morton was confined to a small room under watch, and Cade, still limping from his arrest, had been taken to the nearest jail by the policeman from the village. Yet Holmes, far from sharing in the general satisfaction, moved about with that lean and restless air I knew so well, the manner of a man who saw the curtain drawn across the stage before the final act had been played. He refused to let the Bloodstone be returned to its treasure box just yet, insisting that it remain under his own charge until certain matters were clarified. Over breakfast, he laid out the problem with his usual precision. Morton and Cade, he said, are convenient culprits. Morton had the access, Cade the means to sell, and both had opportunity. Yet we must ask ourselves, who benefits most from the treasure's disappearance, even temporarily? And who has the cleverness to plan not one but two riddles designed to misdirect the pursuit? I suggested that perhaps Morton had written them to add drama and thus distract suspicion. Holmes shook his head. The verse is too precise in its space hints. It suggests a mind closely familiar with the Abbey's structure, more so than Morton has shown. No, Watson, the riddles are the work of someone who moves easily between the Abbey's past and present, who knows where its stone meets its shadow. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was Brother Anselm, his thin hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Grarevel requests your presence in the library. He says there is something you must see." We followed the brother through the covered walkway to the library, a long arched room lined with shelves that smelled of old paper and dust. Dr. Grarevel was standing at the central table, his expression troubled. Before him lay an open old book, its pages yellowed with age. "This was discovered this morning," he explained. Brother Paul was cataloguing a chest of old books when he came upon it. At the back was this loose page. Holmes stepped forward. The page had a passage in Latin, written in a hand that might have been 17th century, but across it, in fresh ink, unmistakably similar to the riddles, was written a third verse. "The heart that once in shadow lay now waits where silent figures stay. Past voices speak from out the stone, yet none may claim the heart their own." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that rare sudden brightness which told me he had seen the path ahead. He said nothing to the rector, merely thanked him and folded the sheet into his pocket. Outside in the covered walkway, he quickened his pace until we were alone. "Watson, the third clue confirms it. The writer is drawing us toward the chapter house, silent figures, the stone carvings of the abbots that line its walls, and past voices, the echo special to that arched room. The Bloodstone may have been moved here briefly as part of a longer plan. But we already have the Bloodstone," I reminded him. "For the moment, but we have the stone, Watson, not the plan." The riddles were never merely about hiding the gem. They were about showing control, showing that its fate could be changed at will under the very noses of those charged with guarding it. That is why I believe Morton and Cade were but tools. Someone else set the conditions, supplied the hiding places, and perhaps even allowed the theft to occur so it could be solved on their terms. Holmes proposed that we inspect the chapter house at once. The key was produced under Dr. Grarevel's reluctant supervision, and we stepped into the cold, dusty space where the carvings lay side by side, their stone hands folded in eternal prayer. The light slanted in through high windows, falling across the worn carvings. Holmes moved carefully from figure to figure, tapping each stone base with his stick, crouching to peer into corners where the cement was cracked. At the carving of Abbot Stephen, he stopped. "Here, Watson, note the base is of 2 pieces, unlike the others carved from a single block, and see these faint scrapes along the join, as if something heavy had been shifted recently." Together we heaved, and the upper slab shifted just enough to reveal a narrow compartment. It was empty. Holmes straightened, dusting his hands. Too late. But the fact of its use tells us much. This hiding place is centuries old, unknown to most. Yet our opponent knew of it, and used it long enough to plant or retrieve something without detection. We replaced the slab and left the chapter house. In the covered walkway, Holmes's mood had grown tense. "The fact that the Bloodstone is now in our possession means nothing, Watson, if its disappearance was only one act in a longer performance. Whoever wrote these riddles has more to play, and I do not intend to be merely part of his audience." Late that afternoon, Holmes requested that Lestrade gather all who had regular access to the Abbey, the brothers, the servants, and Hargreaves. We met in the dining room, its long tables bare except for a single lantern casting sharp shadows. Holmes spoke briefly, asking if anyone had knowledge of the 3 riddles. No one admitted to it. "Then I shall speak plainly," Holmes said. "The writer is among us. That person understands the Abbey's history, its hidden corners, and its symbolic value. Morton and Cade were pawns in a plan that required a theft, a recovery, and now perhaps a second theft. I intend to see the play ended before the final act." The gathering broke up under Lestrade's watchful eye, but as we stepped into the covered walkway once more, a sharp crack echoed from the far walkway. We hurried toward it and found the small wooden door to the church room swinging open, its lock broken. Inside, the shelves of robes had been searched, and Dr. Grerivel's strongbox lay open, empty. "Not the Bloodstone," Lestrade said, searching through the mess. "Just the rector's papers, some church records, a few letters." Holmes was already scanning the floor. "Papers can be copied, changed, or destroyed. More harmful than the theft of gold. And look here, a trail of wax crumbs. Whoever came for the papers was also in contact with the Bloodstone recently." That night, Holmes did not sleep. He sat by the fireplace in our bedroom, the Bloodstone on the table before him, its deep red catching the firelight. "Watson," he said at length, "in every theft there are 3 questions. What was taken? Who took it and why? We have answered only the first 2, and incompletely at that. The why is the hinge upon which this case turns. And when I find it, the door will swing wide to reveal our true opponent." Outside, the Abbey bell rang morning prayer, and its echoes wound through the dark like a call. Somewhere within those cold walls, the mind that had set this game in motion was moving again, unseen, but entirely in control of the board. And beside the red gleam of the Bloodstone, I felt the air thicken with the certainty that the next move was coming, and it would be theirs, not ours. The morning that followed was bleak and wind-lashed, the kind of day when the sky seems determined to press itself down upon the earth. A low mist clung to the Abbey grounds, wrapping the covered walkways and softening the outlines of the towers. From the guest-house window, I watched Holmes pacing the courtyard below, his long coat flaring in the gusts, head bowed in thought. The Bloodstone sat in its leather case upon our table, and I found my eyes wandering to it with a fascination I could not explain. Its deep living red seemed almost to shift with the light, as though something within it stirred. Holmes returned shortly after morning prayer, stamping frost from his boots. "Watson, events are tightening," he said, throwing himself into a chair. "I have confirmed my suspicion. The church-room break-in was not for the rector's letters alone. Those papers contained details of a donor's gift to the Abbey, land bordering Eversham Hall. It was to return to the Abbey upon the donor's death, which occurred only last month. The Fairchild family are now in money difficulty, and that land could save them from ruin if the gift were cancelled by some flaw in the paperwork." I stared. "You think the theft of the Bloodstone is connected to a land dispute?" "I think," Holmes said, "that our mysterious riddle writer uses the treasure as both a lure and a shield. By drawing all attention to the drama of the theft, the true work, the removal or changing of those legal papers, could go on unhindered." Morton and Cade were tools. The mind behind them is another matter entirely. Before I could press him further, Lestrade appeared, cheeks reddened from the cold. "Holmes Morton's talking," he announced. "Says he was approached weeks ago by Cade with an offer, money in exchange for letting him into the treasure box. Claims Cade had instructions from someone else, but he doesn't know who. Says all he got were the riddles written on slips left for him in the church room." Holmes's eyes sharpened and the handwriting scrawled slanted, nothing like Morton's or Cade's. "Good. Keep Morton comfortable, Lestrade, but do not let him think himself entirely free of danger. A frightened man will cling to his first story. A man who sees a chance at escape will tell you the truth, if only to buy it." After Lestrade left, Holmes turned to me. "We must speak to Lady Eleanor again, Watson. If my theory is correct, the Fairchilds have more at stake in this than they care to admit." The road to Eversham Hall was no warmer than before, and the house loomed out of the mist like a ghost. Lady Eleanor received us in a smaller sitting room this time, a fire struggling against the draughts. She was composed, but her eyes showed a weariness. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes began, "I will be frank. The Abbey is in possession of a gift of land once belonging to your family. That gift will take effect immediately, unless certain documents recently stolen are shown to contain a flaw. It is my belief that someone connected to your household has an interest in those documents being unavailable." Her lips tightened. "You have no right to suggest." Holmes raised a hand. "I suggest nothing I cannot prove. Cade's visit to the hall, the recent walking about your unused outbuilding, and the fact that a limping man asked the way here in the village are all facts, not guesses. I will also add that the riddles used to mask the Bloodstone's theft contain details of the Abbey structure, known to few outsiders, details which an old family with historic ties to the Abbey might well possess." There was a long silence. Lady Eleanor's gaze flickered to the fire, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "If what you say is true, Mr. Holmes, then someone has acted without my knowledge, though perhaps with my father's consent. The hall is under debt, heavy debt, and my father is proud, too proud to sell openly what remains of our land." Holmes nodded his head slightly. "Pride is a costly luxury, madam, especially when it hires clever allies." We left her there pale but firm, and began the walk back toward the Abbey. Holmes's stride was long and determined. "She knows more than she will say, Watson. The writer of the riddles is close to her, close enough to move between hall and Abbey without notice, and if I am correct, we shall have proof before this day is out." By the time we reached the Abbey, the mist had thickened, muffling the sound of our steps. We found Lestrade in the covered walkway, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "Holmes, there's been another message found on Dr. Greriville's desk just an hour ago. No one saw who left it. The note was in the same spider-like hand. The heart you hold is not your own. Return it before the day has flown, or night will claim what dawn has spared, and all will lose what none have dared." Holmes read it twice, his face unreadable. "So our opponent wishes the Bloodstone returned to its treasure box before nightfall. That is curious, Watson. Why insist on its return now, unless its absence is about to expose something hidden in its place?" He snapped the note shut and walked off toward the south cross-section. The treasure stood as we had last seen it, its ornate panels gleaming dully in the dim light. Holmes placed the Bloodstone within, closed the lock with a click, and stood back. "Now we wait," he said. "We have given our fish the bait it demands. Let us see if it will rise to it." The hours that followed were slow and tense. Holmes took up position in the shadows of the side aisle. Lestrade stationed himself behind a pillar, and I hid myself in the small chapel beyond the cross-section arch. Outside, the winter afternoon dimmed into early dusk, the light fading to a faint icy blue through the windows. It was near evening prayer when a figure entered, tall, cloaked, moving with a purposeful ease of someone who knew exactly where to step to avoid notice. The hood was drawn low, but as the figure approached the treasure box, Holmes stepped silently forward. "I think," he said, "you will find that heart no longer beats to your measure." The figure froze, then turned slowly. The hood fell back to reveal Lady Eleanor's brother, Lord Charles Fairchild. His expression was one of cold irritation rather than guilt. "You have been meddling, Holmes," he said. "Had you kept to the theft, you might have had your little victory, but you chose to dig deeper. And here we are." "Indeed," Holmes said softly. "Here we are. The riddles were yours. The building clues, the misdirection, the timing of each message. It all shows the mark of a mind trained in both history and strategy. You planned the theft, to mask the removal of the land documents, intending to return the Bloodstone at the moment most convenient for your own ends. But your pawns overplayed their parts, and you were forced to act before your position was secure. Fairchild's gaze shifted toward the treasure box. You have no proof. On the contrary, Holmes said, I have the piece of cloth from the writing room torn from your own hunting coat, which I noted in the hall's cloakroom. I have the witness who saw you with Cade in the village, and I have the changed gift papers, hidden within the treasure box itself, until the Bloodstone's return created a reason for you to open it again. You see, I replaced the gem hours ago, but not before placing a very small, very telling mark upon the compartment. Holmes stepped to the treasure box, unlocked it, and lifted the Bloodstone aside. From the hole beneath, he drew a folded sheet of old paper. Fairchild's face tightened. Lestrade emerged from the shadows, his satisfaction evident. That's enough for me, Lord Charles. You'll come with us. As they led him away, Holmes replaced the Bloodstone once more. The red glow within the treasure box seemed steadier now, as though some quiet tension had been resolved. Holmes and I lingered a moment longer in the cold hush of the chapel. It was never about the gem, was it? I said. No, Watson. It was about possession and control. The Bloodstone was the stage prop. The real play was in the shadows it cast. Outside night had fallen fully, the mist wrapping the abbey in secrecy once more. Yet the great bell rang clear and strong, as if to remind us that some truths once uncovered ring louder than all the whispers in the dark. The morning after Lord Charles Fairchild's arrest broke with a pale sun struggling through torn strips of cloud, the frost still sharp upon the covered walkway grass. A deceptive calm lay over Eversham Abbey. The brothers moved quietly through their routines, and the air was filled with the low murmur of psalms drifting from the choir. Yet I sensed that beneath this surface, unease still gripped the place. Dr. Grarevel's relief at the recovery of the Bloodstone was lessened by the knowledge that scandal now touched the Abbey's oldest patron family, and Lestrade, though outwardly satisfied, was restless, like a man convinced his net might have missed the largest fish. Holmes, for his part, had that strange mixture of relaxation and heightened awareness that came over him after the solving of a central knot. But before he had tied off the loose ends, he sat in the library, a beam of winter light falling across his long fingers as he examined the 3 riddle slips yet again. Watson, he said without looking up, tell me what strikes you about these messages if you read them in order. I did so, murmuring them aloud, and confessed that aside from their tone and fancy imagery, I could see only their misleading nature. Exactly, Holmes replied. Their order shows the movement of the Bloodstone itself, from the treasure box to the shadow joint of the north aisle, then to the chapter house, and finally back to the treasure box. Each riddle was timed to match a transfer. Lord Charles wrote them, yes, but he did not carry out all the moves. The physical movement of the gem and the hiding of the changed documents required someone with unblocked access to locked and sacred spaces at exact hours. I frowned. Morton again? Holmes shook his head. Morton was convenient for the first act, but too closely watched thereafter. No, Watson. There is another hand still unaccounted for, and until I identify it, I cannot be certain the Bloodstone will not vanish a second time. At that moment, Lestrade entered, looking annoyed. Holmes, we've just discovered that one of the Abbey's side gates was left unlocked in the night. No sign of forced entry, but the frost shows footprints, single file, coming in and going out. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. Show me. We followed Lestrade to the north wall where the small side gate stood slightly open. The ground beyond was a pale sheet of frozen earth, the prints crisp. Holmes crouched, tracing them with his finger. A narrow boot, heel worn evenly, not our limping friend, and the depth light almost dainty. A woman's footprint, I would guess, and not heavily shod. The prints led toward the covered walkway, but vanished on the stone walk where frost had not settled. Holmes rose, his eyes narrowing. A message, Watson. Someone has come to show they can still reach the Abbey undetected. The arrest of Fairchild was only the removal of one piece. The player remains. We spent the rest of the morning in careful questioning among the brothers and staff. Nothing unusual had been heard or seen, except for Mrs. Porter, the cook, who recalled a faint scent of lavender in the covered walkway after morning prayer, lingering longer than it ought in the cold air. Holmes's expression sharpened at this. Lavender, Watson, an unwise choice for a nighttime visitor. Scent clings to cloth and cloth leaves threads. In the early afternoon, Holmes requested the key to the loft above the north aisle, the space where he had earlier found signs of disturbance. The loft was dim and narrow, filled with dust and the scent of old timber. We moved carefully along the beams, Holmes's eyes sweeping every crack. Near the far corner he stopped, picking something from a splinter. It was a fine thread, pale lilac in color. Holmes rolled it between thumb and finger. "Not from any robe or church robe here," he murmured. "This belongs to a woman's garment, wool or cashmere, and I can think of only one woman besides the servants who has moved freely between Hall and Abbey during these past weeks." I caught his meaning. "Lady Eleanor. She is the most logical candidate," Holmes said, "though logic must bow to proof. If she is indeed our unseen helper, her reason would differ from her brother's. Lord Charles sought the papers for money rescue. Lady Eleanor perhaps sought the Bloodstone itself, for reasons yet unclear. But whether she worked with him or in parallel, her role must be uncovered before the trail cools." Holmes proposed an afternoon walk to the village, supposedly to call upon the local lawyer regarding the gift, but in reality to take the path that passed the hall's outer gardens. The winter sun hung low as we approached, and through the bare branches of the yew trees we saw Lady Eleanor herself, cloaked in grey, speaking to a cloaked figure I did not recognize. They parted quickly, too quickly, when they caught sight of us and the stranger disappeared toward the far gate. Holmes tipped his hat politely to Lady Eleanor. "A fine day for a walk, madam." Her composure was perfect. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, though the cold is rather cutting. I was merely taking the air before attending to my father." Holmes asked about Lord Charles's situation, but she brushed the topic aside with measured dignity. We exchanged a few more polite words before leaving, but once out of earshot, Holmes said that man was no villager. His walk was military, and his boots carried the faint red clay from the road toward the southern rock quarries. "I should very much like to know what task brings him here on a day when the Hall claims no visitors." We returned to the Abbey as twilight deepened. The Bloodstone was still in place, the treasure box untouched, but Holmes insisted we keep watch that evening, placing Lestrade in the cross-section, myself in the covered walkway, and taking for himself the loft above the aisle. Hours passed in stillness, broken only by the occasional sigh of the wind through the arches. Then, some time after evening prayers, I heard the faintest scrape of stone from the direction of the north aisle. I signaled to Lestrade, and we moved silently toward it. A cloaked figure stood at the treasure box, the lock already open. The hood turned, and I saw Lady Eleanor's face pale in the candlelight. She did not startle at our presence. Rather, she looked at us with calm defiance. "You have no right," she began, but Holmes's voice cut across hers from above. "On the contrary, Lady Eleanor, I have every right. You left your mark in the loft in the form of a lilac thread, and you announced your continued freedom with your footprints in the frost. You were not content to let your brother's arrest end the matter, because your purpose was never bound to his. You sought the Bloodstone for yourself." Her chin lifted. "To return it to its rightful place, the Abbey's treasures were seized from my family centuries ago, under the excuse of devotion. I intended only to reclaim what was ours by heritage." Holmes descended from the loft, his gaze steady. An argument for a court, not a covered walkway in the dead of night. He played a dangerous game, using riddles and helpers to divide attention, knowing the treasure's loss would hide your search for those papers, or for the stone itself. Your control over the Abbey's points of access speaks to months of planning, perhaps longer. Lady Eleanor's composure wavered for the first time, and she glanced toward the darkened choir. "You cannot prove I took it." Holmes stepped to the treasure box, revealing the gem within. "No, because you have not yet done so, but you have shown you could. And that is enough for Lestrade here to consider whether your role in the theft's planning meets the law's definition of helping." Lestrade moved forward, but Holmes held up a hand. "I think for now Lady Eleanor will do well to remain at the Hall under careful watch. Her father's health and the Hall's standing may be preserved if she cooperates fully in returning any documents or property removed from the Abbey." She nodded her head stiffly, her eyes cold, and allowed Lestrade to escort her away. When they were gone, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe her that it was heritage, not profit?" Holmes closed the treasure box, the lock clicking softly. "Belief is for those content without proof. I deal in facts, and the fact is she's no longer in a position to act. Whether her reasons were rooted in family pride or personal gain, The Bloodstone is safe for now. But remember, Watson, possession is only half the battle. Control is the rest, and that may yet be contested. Outside the wind rose, and the Abbey's great bell rang against the darkness, its sound rolling out over the frozen fields, as though to warn any still listening in the shadows that their hour was ending. The next morning dawned in brittle sunlight, the frost clinging so fiercely to the covered walkway lawn that it cracked beneath the boots of the brothers hurrying to morning prayer. From our bedroom window, the Abbey seemed a picture of medieval peace. Smoke curling from the kitchen flue, the bell tower standing calm against a pale sky. But I had learned enough in our days here to know that such appearances were dangerous. Beneath the ordered prayers and the solemn ringing of the hours, tension still ran deep. The Bloodstone was back in its treasure box, yes, but Holmes's manner told me plainly that the real danger had not passed. We ate breakfast in near silence, Holmes turning the 3 riddle slips over in his hands, as though he expected them to reveal something new. When I suggested that Lady Eleanor's involvement might have marked the end of the affair, he gave me one of those quick sideways glances that showed both amusement and warning. "My dear Watson," he said, "you continue to think of this as a simple theft. It is a campaign, a sustained operation with a center, sides, and tricks. Lady Eleanor was one trick, Morton another, Cade a third. But the general, the one directing the battle, remains invisible. Until I have that figure in my grasp, the game is merely paused." Before I could answer, Lestrade appeared at the door, his forehead wrinkled. "Holmes, you'd best come. There's been another incident." This time in the library. We followed him through the covered walkway into the long arched room where Dr. Grarevel awaited us. On the central table lay a thick old book, its leather binding slashed clean through with a blade. The rector's hands trembled as he pointed to it. "This book contains the Abbey's oldest inventory records," he said. "Last night it was locked away. This morning Brother Paul found it like this, and a page missing." Holmes bent over the cut binding, examining it closely. "Neatly done. Whoever removed that page used a thin, sharp knife, and they did so in haste. No care taken to hide the cut. The missing page, what did it contain?" "An inventory from 1548, Dr. Grarevel replied. "Mostly ordinary items sold or lost after the dissolution, but it did list certain treasures transferred into the keeping of local families for safe custody." Holmes straightened slowly. "And among those families, the Fairchilds," Grarevel admitted reluctantly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "So our invisible general has turned to history to strengthen their claim, or to destroy the record that contradicts it. That missing page will tell us more about motive than the whole of Fairchild's confession." He turned to Lestrade. "The theft occurred between evening prayers and morning prayer. Your guards were posted." "I was," Lestrade said, looking uncomfortable, "but they were outside the library, not in it. Only the brothers and myself have keys." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed something. "Then the thief had no need to force entry. They had a key or were given one. By midday, the news of the library incident had filtered through the Abbey, the brothers moving about with lowered voices. Holmes and I took to the covered walkway, speaking in low tones. "Watson," he said, "consider the timing. Lady Eleanor is placed under watch at the Hall. Her brother is in custody, yet someone slips into the Abbey's library, past Lestrade's men, and removes a page that connects the Fairchilds to the Bloodstone's disputed history. It is almost as if the mastermind wished to assure us that their reach extends even now." "And you think that mastermind is here in the Abbey?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that they have been here all along." The afternoon brought a biting wind from the east. We had just returned to our rooms when a knock came at the door. It was Hargreaves, the driver, his cap twisting nervously in his hands. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Holmes, "but I thought you should know. Someone's been asking after you in the village. Strange fellow, kept to the shadows. Didn't give a name, but he left this at the inn with instructions it'd be passed to you." Hargreaves handed over a small envelope, unmarked, except for Holmes's name in that same spider-like hand as the riddles. Inside was a single scrap of old paper bearing 4 words. "One move remains, Holmes." Holmes looked at it with an expression almost of satisfaction. "Our opponent declares the endgame, Watson. That is either showing off or certainty, and I intend to learn which before nightfall." We spent the next hours in a careful circuit of the Abbey, Holmes checking doors, staircases, and passages with that cat-like lightness he used when expecting to find a hidden route. At one point he paused in the north cross-section, eyes fixed upon the floor stones. "Here," he murmured, crouching to tap the stone with his stick, hollow and the cement newer than its neighbours. "This is not structural. This is hiding." With Dr. Greville's reluctant permission, Holmes pried up the slab to reveal a shallow hole. It was empty, but for a few grains of red sealing wax, the same shade we had already connected with the Bloodstone's compartment. "Evidence of a temporary hiding place," Holmes said. "Used recently, perhaps as part of the same chain of transfers that the Riddles traced. And this location, Watson, is within sight of the treasure box, yet shielded from the main aisle. A perfect halfway house for something that must be moved in stages." As darkness fell, Holmes laid his plan before Lestrade. The treasure box would be left as it was, the Abbey seemingly unguarded, except for the regular watch of the brothers. Holmes, Lestrade, and I would hide ourselves in positions chosen to cover the cross-section, covered walkway, and the approach from the side gate. The night deepened into that strange stillness which comes when frost holds the ground in a grip, and even the wind seems reluctant to stir. From my place in the covered walkway shadows, I could see the faint gleam of the treasure box's gold, and beyond it the tall outline of Holmes by a pillar. Time stretched. My breath formed little clouds in the dim air. Then, just as the bell for morning prayer began to ring, a figure slipped through the side gate, not cloaked or hooded this time, but bareheaded, a man with close-cropped hair and a face I did not recognize. He moved quickly to the cross-section, knelt by the hollow floor stone Holmes had discovered, and drew something from within his coat. Holmes's voice rang out, low but commanding. "That will do." The man froze, then ran, not toward the side gate, but deeper into the Abbey. Lestrade sprang from his post to cut him off, but the intruder knew the passages too well. For a moment it seemed he might vanish entirely. Then Holmes, moving like a striking hawk, stopped him at the junction to the library. The struggle was brief. When the man was secured, Holmes took from his coat a leather pouch, empty. Holmes's eyes glittered in the lamplight. "You see, Watson, our opponent has more than one agent. This fellow was sent to retrieve something placed here earlier, perhaps by Lady Eleanor herself, perhaps by another go-between. And the fact that the pouch is empty tells us that the final move has already been made elsewhere in the Abbey." It was near dawn when Holmes finally spoke again after hours of silent searching through the covered walkways. "The last piece will be dangerous, Watson. The enemy has signaled the endgame, and I believe them. But when they make that final play, we shall be ready." The Abbey bell rang for morning prayer. Its sound clear and cold over the frozen fields. Somewhere within those ancient walls, the unseen general still held the advantage of the next move. But Holmes's gaze was set, his mind as sharp as the frost, on the stones, and I knew the counterstroke was already forming. The day that followed was one of those curiously strained intervals where every movement, every sound seems filled with meaning. The air over Eversham Abbey was knife-edged with frost, the sun a pale coin behind a veil of thin cloud. The brothers went about their services with studied calmness, but I caught sneaky glances exchanged in the covered walkway, and even Lestrade's policemen walked their patrols with a weariness that showed expectation. We all felt it, the awareness that something was about to happen. Holmes was unusually still that morning, settled in the library at the long central table, his chin resting lightly on pointed fingers. Before him lay the 3 riddles, the scrap, bearing the words, "One move remains, Holmes," and a rough plan of the Abbey's layout he had drawn himself. He barely glanced up when I entered. "Watson," he said, "the game must take place in a location both symbolically fitting and tactically sound. If you had written those riddles to tease an opponent, you would choose a final scene that draws him into your chosen ground." I suggested the treasure box itself, but Holmes shook his head. Too obvious, too well guarded now. "No, our opponent has always worked in layers, using the treasure as a decoy, while the true purpose lies elsewhere. Consider the clues as a single composition. Shadow, stone, past voices, silent figures, all point to one site, the chapter house. It was used before, it will be used again." He rose, slipping the Bloodstone into his pocket. "Today, Watson, we set the trap. Lestrade must be in place before evening prayers. The plan was simple in its outline, but subtle in its carrying out. The chapter house would be left apparently unguarded, its door unlocked. The treasure box supposedly moved there for temporary safekeeping during some invented work in the cross-section. In reality, the treasure box was empty. The Bloodstone would be hidden on Holmes's person and 3 separate points of watching established. Lestrade would position himself behind the carvings at the far end, I in the narrow passage leading from the covered walkway, and Holmes, well, Holmes had his own place in mind which he did not share. The hours before the appointed time passed slowly. A low, colourless sky pressed down upon the abbey, and a faint snow began to fall, dusting the covered walkway grass and quieting the sound of the bell. Inside the chapter house, the dim light from the high windows gave the carved faces of the abbots a solemn watchfulness. I positioned myself in the passage, my ears straining for the slightest footstep. It was during the hush between the ringing for evening prayers and the brothers' slow approach to the choir that I heard it, the soft click of the chapter house door. A figure slipped in, moving with the quiet certainty of one who knew the room closely. The hood of the cloak was thrown back, and in the dimness I recognized Brother Anselm. His thin face was set in an expression of focused concentration as he crossed directly to the carving of Abbot Stephen. He knelt, fingers seeking the join in the base we had discovered earlier. With practiced movements, he shifted the slab aside and reached within. When his hand came out, it held a small folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He rose and turned toward the door, only to find Holmes standing there, as if he had appeared from the stone itself. "That will do, Brother Anselm," Holmes said quietly. "You have carried the game far enough." For a moment Anselm's gaze flicked between Holmes, myself emerging from the passage, and the shadowed end of the room where Lestrade now stepped forward. Then his shoulders sagged, and he handed the bundle to Holmes without a word. Holmes placed it on the nearest bench and unwrapped it. Inside lay the missing page from the Abbey's inventory, along with the changed gift papers taken from the church room. Lestrade gave a low whistle. "So it was you all along. You planted the riddles, set Morton and Cade moving, even let the Fairchilds play their part. All to get your hands on these documents." Anselm's voice, when it came, was calm, but touched with something like scorn. "The Abbey is dying, Inspector. Its gifts are small, its repairs endless. That land would have secured its future for a century. The Bloodstone was the only lever strong enough to shift attention while the true work was done. I gave the Fairchilds just enough truth to set them moving, then used their mistakes to mask my own." Holmes looked at him with a mixture of professional respect and moral disapproval. "You built your campaign with skill, Brother Anselm, but you made a mistake in underestimating the number of variables you could control. A plan that relies on the ignorance of others is always one revelation away from collapse." Anselm met his gaze. "And yet, Mr. Holmes, had you not come, it would have succeeded." Holmes nodded his head slightly, as if agreeing with the point, then passed the papers to Lestrade. "I believe these belong in the rector's keeping. As for Brother Anselm, I leave it to your judgment, Inspector. His reasons were not entirely selfish, but the law will have its due." Lestrade took his prisoner with a grim nod, and soon the sound of their steps faded down the covered walkway. Holmes and I remained a moment longer in the cold hush of the chapter house. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, "how often the most dangerous minds are not those driven by greed alone, but by a cause they believe to be just." Anselm convinced himself that the end justified the means. In such cases, the means tend to grow more fancy and more dangerous. We returned to the cross-section where Dr. Grarivel awaited us. His relief at the return of the documents was genuine, though lessened by the shock of Anselm's betrayal. The Bloodstone was placed back in its treasure box under his solemn care, the lock sealed, and the key returned to his keeping. That night, over a late supper in the guest-house, Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "The game, I think, is at last concluded. We have our general, our campaign, and our conclusion. What remains is only the thinking back." "And what do you make of it?" I asked. "That in every structure, however ancient, there are joints, points where old and new meet. They are the weaknesses in stone and in men. Our opponent understood that. So must we." The snow had thickened by the time we went to bed. From my bedroom, I could see the Abbey's towers rising pale against the night sky, their outlines softened by the falling flakes. Somewhere within those walls, centuries of history slept undisturbed once more, the Bloodstone resting in its shrine, its red heart silent. Holmes stood for a long while at the window before turning away. "Come, Watson," he said. "There will be other games, other generals. For now let us leave Eversham Abbey to its peace, such as it may keep." And so the next morning we departed on the early train, the Abbey's bell ringing faintly behind us through the snow. A sound at once like farewell and warning, carrying with it the memory of shadows, riddles, and a red stone that had for a time held us all in its hold. The train carried us away from Worcestershire, through a landscape muffled in snow, the white fields flashing past in slow, unbroken stretches. The warmth of the compartment and the steady rhythm of the wheels provided a strange contrast to the events of the last week. I sat opposite Holmes, who was deep in one of his long silences, his eyes fixed not on the passing scenery, but on some inward view of facts and conclusions. His fingers drummed lightly on the armrest, an unconscious beat that told me his mind was still circling Eversham Abbey. At last he spoke. "It is always the aftermath, Watson, that is most useful. Once the moves are known and the board laid bare, one can see not only what was done, but what might have been done. In this case, I remain impressed by the cleverness of our unseen builder, until that his human weakness crept in through the side door." "Oh, you mean Brother Anselm's miscalculation?" Holmes nodded his head. "Exactly. His greatest strength was in planning for possibilities, multiple agents, layered misdirection, the manipulation of personal reasons, and yet for all that he left himself at the mercy of time. Once the Fairchild element collapsed, his window narrowed. That was when he made a mistake." I could not help but feel a lingering sympathy for the monk. He claimed his aim was the Abbey's welfare and no doubt believed it. Holmes said his tone even. But a cause that demands secrecy breeds corruption of judgment. The moment he decided the Bloodstone should be a pawn in his game, he surrendered the moral high ground and in due course his position entirely. Our conversation stopped into silence as the train slowed into a small country station. A porter passed along the platform, the distant muffled sound of his boots on the snow fading as we pulled away again. The quiet gave me time to replay the sequence of events in my own mind, from the first letter, calling us to the final unmasking in the chapter house. The entire affair had been a maze of shifting suspicion, each clue folding back upon itself, until the whole resembled one of those fancy patterns in the Abbey's stone floors, seemingly decorative until one understood the path it traced. By early afternoon we reached London, the familiar swirl of smoke and steam closing about us as the train slid into Paddington. The city's bustle was almost disorienting after the enclosed stillness of Eversham. A cab carried us through the grey winter streets to Baker Street, where the fire in our sitting room had been lit in anticipation of our return. Mrs. Hudson had set out tea, and for a time we sat comfortably by the fireplace, letting the warmth drive the cold from our bones. Holmes had not touched his violin in days, but now he took it from its case, tuned it with quick precision, and let a low, thoughtful phrase drift into the air. The sound seemed to gather the threads of the case into something almost touchable, a mood that carried the weight of stone corridors and the scent of frost-bound gardens. After a few minutes, he set the instrument aside and reached for his pipe. "I've been thinking, Watson, of how much hinged upon the riddles themselves. They were not merely decoration, but structural to the whole. Each one was a calculated step, designed to manipulate the investigation's pace and direction. Had even one been left out or poorly timed, the pattern would have been broken. And yet I said they ultimately gave you the trail you needed. Quite so. In this our opponent displayed both brilliance and pride. Brilliance in weaving building and symbolic clues. Pride in assuming they would not be unraveled by an opponent, willing to examine their internal logic without distraction. The rest of that day passed in a welcome quiet, though it was the kind of quiet in which one feels the pressure of an unfinished thought. It was not until evening, as the street lamps glowed pale through the fog, that Holmes broke it. "There is one element, Watson, that I cannot yet account for, and that is the man you and I saw speaking to Lady Eleanor in the Hall's gardens, the one with the military walk and the quarry clay on his boots." He vanished from the board after that moment. Anselm did not name him. Fairchild denied knowledge, and yet I am certain he was no accident. There is always the possibility of an undisclosed ally or even a higher sponsor, but without further movement, the trail runs cold. I recalled the man's quick withdrawal and the guarded expression on Lady Eleanor's face. You think he may return to the game? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. If the game itself continues, yes. The Bloodstone is safe for the present, but the forces that sought it, whether for gain, for sentiment, or for strategy, are not dissolved. They are merely waiting for the board to reset. Over the next 2 days, our normal life resumed in part. Clients came and went, telegrams arrived with their usual urgent brevity, and the world beyond Eversham pressed in once more. Yet I noticed that Holmes kept the folder on the Bloodstone case within easy reach, and more than once he leafed through its contents as if turning a puzzle piece in the light. On the 3rd evening after our return, as I sat reading by the fire, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel addressed in a hand I did not recognize. Holmes took it, examined the handwriting, and with a flick of his blade cut the string. Inside was a square of old paper, blank except for a single, neatly printed line. The shadow has not moved. Holmes studied it for a long moment before handing it to me. Our unseen writer again, he said. The phrasing is curious, less a threat than a statement of position. A declaration that the underlying condition remains unchanged. I felt an involuntary chill. You mean to say the Bloodstone affair is not truly over? I mean to say, Holmes replied, that in matters such as these, closure is a fiction. The treasure's symbolism, its entwining with property and pride, and the network of those who have touched the plan, all these remain. The board may be cleared, but the players still stand in the wings. He rose and went to the window, looking out over the fog-bound street. For now, Watson, we wait. But should the shadow stir again, we will be ready to follow its movement. I could think of nothing to add. The fire crackled. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. And in the heart of London, far from the frozen-covered walkways of Eversham, the echo of that red stone seemed still to pulse in the quiet. Holmes remained at the window, his figure outlined against the dim gaslight beyond. You see, my dear fellow, he said at last, there is always one more move. The snow had long since melted from London's streets. When the final piece of the Bloodstone affair fell into place, it was early spring, one of those pale tentative days when the air is sharp, but the sun holds a hint of warmth. Holmes and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm once more. The events of Eversham Abbey pushed, I thought, to the ranks of those solved cases which become little more than a line in Holmes's index. That morning, however, Mrs. Hudson brought in a telegram which Holmes read with an abrupt sharpening of the eyes. Without a word, he passed it across to me. It was from Dr. Grerival. Unexpected visitor at Abbey seeks meeting. Name Captain Armitage, insists on discussing unfinished matters regarding Bloodstone. Strong military bearing. Please advise. The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's expression told me all I needed to know. The man in the gardens, he said simply, the shadow that never moved. Within hours we were bound once more for Worcestershire, the fields greening under the shy sun. Dr. Grerival met us in the covered walkway, his unease plain. Captain Armitage arrived this morning from abroad. He claims to have been entrusted with certain affairs on behalf of the Fairchild family, but refuses to speak further without your presence. We found Armitage in the library, a tall, thin man with that upright carriage which marks the career soldier. His eyes coldly steady, fixed on Holmes as we entered. You've been a hard man to catch at home, Mr. Holmes, he said. I have a proposition of sorts. The Bloodstone, as you know, has value beyond its mere material worth. There are interested parties abroad, parties who would pay handsomely for its purchase. Holmes looked at him with mild curiosity. You travelled from overseas to offer me a bribe. Armitage's lips curved faintly. To offer you an opportunity. You are a man who understands leverage. I can place you in a position to profit without risk, and the Abbey will be none the poorer if certain replacements are made. Holmes was silent for a moment, then stepped to the window, his gaze on the sunlit grass beyond. Your plan, he said at last, has a fatal flaw. You have assumed the Bloodstone remains in the treasure box. In truth, the object presently on display is a replica, a commission I arranged before leaving Eversham. The original is secured beyond the reach of you or your interested parties. Armitage stiffened, though he masked it quickly. Then you've outplayed me. But you must know this isn't over. Holmes turned, his eyes alight with that cool, decisive gleam I knew so well. On the contrary, Captain, it is over. You are the last thread in a tapestry I've been unpicking for months. You were the unseen hand behind Lady Eleanor's confidence, the messenger for Anselm's more delicate communications, and the guarantor to foreign buyers who thought the Bloodstone would be theirs by spring. You stayed still while others moved, ensuring their mistakes would not touch you. That was your strength and your undoing. Lestrade, who had been waiting quietly by the door, stepped forward with a warrant in hand. Captain Armitage, you'll come with me. There's enough here to keep you from stirring up trouble in Abbeys or anywhere else for a good long while. The arrest was made with quiet efficiency, and by the time we left the library, the captain was on his way to London under police escort. Later, in Dr. Grarevel's study, Holmes handed over a sealed package. The genuine Bloodstone rector. I advise keeping its location known only to yourself and one other you trust completely. And perhaps, he added, consider that some treasures protect themselves better in obscurity than in fame. Grarevel's thanks were heartfelt, but Holmes deflected them with his usual air of detachment. We left Eversham Abbey that afternoon, the bell ringing softly as we passed beneath the gatehouse arch. On the return journey, I could not help remarking on the thoroughness of his precautions. You had the real Bloodstone out of the Abbey before the first arrest was made. Of course, Holmes replied. From the moment I saw how many hands were reaching for it, I knew that even victory in the open game would leave it vulnerable. An unseen safeguard was the only way to end it on my terms. And now, he said, settling back in his seat, the board is cleared. Every player has been revealed, every reason laid bare. The Bloodstone rests where no shadow can reach it. That, Watson, is what I call a conclusion. He closed his eyes as the train rattled on, and I sat in silence watching the countryside slip past. The red heart of Eversham Abbey would beat quietly in the dark now, its mystery resolved, its guardianship secure. And though I knew there would be other cases, other opponents, I could not shake the sense that this one, woven of riddles, shadows, and patient hands, had touched something deeper in Holmes's mind than most. As we reached London, and the familiar streets welcomed us home, Holmes glanced at me with a faintest smile. You see, my dear fellow, there really was one last move. It just happened to be mine.